John Croy, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So today it's Wildcards Book 14 on the table. It's on the table tonight. This is the second part of the Putative Card Sharks trilogy. I spent 3 videos rhapsodizing about Volume 13 since it's such a favorite. I'm going to try to do 14 in just one video, although I actually do like 14 a lot as well, but I think I can maybe get through it a little faster. So this one continues. Stephen Lai is still our sort of our guide through this epic. He wrote the interstitial for the previous book about Hannah Davis and Quasi-Man uncovering the Card Sharks conspiracy. That's still essentially the focus of this one. Stephen Lai, I call him by a different pronunciation each time. Stephen Lee or Lay or Lai is once again doing the interstitial and sort of moving things forward right off of the last book, which I mentioned that the last book has a really good last line, which I will still stand by, but it is a cliffhanger, and I feel like if I get too into detail about what Stephen Lee does in his interstitial in 14, it'll sort of effectively kind of spoil that cliffhanger a little bit. So suffice to say, though, that the Hannah Davis Quasi-Man Card Shark stuff continues via the interstitial, but also via the individual stories. There are once again 7. Last time, all 7 stories were flashbacks. This time, the 7 stories actually do move the Card Shark story forward as we get to see the different protagonists of these different stories kind of tackle different arms of the Card Sharks conspiracy. The overall thrust of this one is that actually the Card Sharks are actually they're not really defeated, but they are over the course of the book dealt some very serious blows to the point where they sort of have one kind of doomsday weapon left at the end of the book, which is the Black Trump virus, which is a virus that's been tailored to be lethal to all wild cards while leaving gnats, uninfected people alive. So it's sort of it's essentially a final genocidal solution to the wild cards problem by the Card Sharks, and that's where the book ends. To set up Black Trump, the volume 15, but that leaves volume 14 free to essentially be the volume that sees the Card Sharks being dealt some satisfying defeats, since the Card Sharks are very much kind of in the ascendancy in the first part of the triad, as is only logical, narratively speaking. Also, it's interesting. One of the interesting things to me about volume 14 is that it's very similar to the middle section of the Jumper Triad, which is the previous triad, although that one's actually 4 books, 8, 9, 10, and 11. But volume 8 sets up the Jumpers as this incredibly potent threat that seems kind of unbeatable, and then over the course of volume 9 we do see sort of holes being punched in their formidability thanks to the particular talents of certain key aces. Volume 14 is somewhat similar to that, not only in the structure but also in the fact that it's some of the same aces that we saw having such satisfying triumphs in volume 9. It's once again those same aces in volume 14. So specifically Black Shadow and Mr. Nobody, who are certainly 2 of my favorites, I think largely because of how satisfying their stories are first in volume 9, Jokertown Shuffle, and then in this one, Marked Cards. In both cases, they sort of get to be part of the sort of vanguard of superpower protagonists who actually are able to deal some defeats to these seemingly monolithic and overwhelmingly seemingly unbeatable foes. So kind of an interesting thing. 9 and 14 make for some interesting parallels there. So going through each story one by one, there's Two of a Kind, which is by Walton Simons, featuring Mr. Nobody. Just a good, fun Mr. Nobody story. Sees him going up against George G. Battle, who had kind of betrayed him during Volume 11, Dealer's Choice. and also it also is notable for establishing a new status quo, an updated status quo for Jay Aykroyd, who left Takis at the end of Volume 10 with a sort of what would you call it, a kind of cachet of jewels. Tachyon gave both Captain Trips and Jay Aykroyd some wealth, some precious stones that they could return to Earth with. And then in Volume 12, I didn't mention it when I talked about Turn of the Cards, but in that volume, Captain Trips kind of loses his jewels right away and is back to being down on his luck. But Jay Aykroyd has made some sound investments, and he's also teamed with Jerry Strauss, a.k.a. Mr. Nobody, who's already incredibly wealthy, and they've formed the Aykroyd and Crichton Detective Agency. Jerry has taken on the alias of Crichton in order to preserve his anonymity, since he's to the world at large, it's believed that his ace power is non-existent, that it burned out after he turned from great ape to human back in Volume 4, Aces Abroad. So we actually get to see much more of the Aykroyd and Crichton Detective Agency in the next book, but it's a cool development for Jay Aykroyd. He goes from being this kind of more kind of seedy lone private eye in this kind of seedy office in Times Square in sleazy 80s New York, and now he's got this kind of impressive array of investigators working for him. There's also a bit about the fact that two former mounts of Team Elise, Zélie Jorouge and Sasha Starfin, who both did some pretty terrible things to Jay Aykroyd when they were under Team Elise's control back in Volume 7, Dead Man's Hand. But of course, they were under Team Elise's control, and they weren't really themselves. And both of them, we learn, have been hired. Zélie is the receptionist at the Aykroyd and Crichton Detective Agency, and Sasha is on the payroll as well as an operative. So it's kind of nice to think about it. Kind of just it's never really dwelled on, but it's just something that is there in the background for a reader to kind of enjoy the fact that Jay Aykroyd he's a good guy. He doesn't hold a grudge, and he recognizes that the victims of Team Elise were not in their right minds, and therefore deserve a shot at some steady employment, and so they're employed by Jay's agency, which is cool. So yeah, and it's a good story overall, just a straightforward action story. We get to see Mr. Nobody utilizing his talents. I think Walton Simons at this point writes the character so fluidly, and he's just always fun to see. And he, at this point, I think this kind of cements him, at least for me, cements him as a favorite. Next up is My Sweet Lord by Vic Milan, starring Captain Trips and the Mechanic. I mentioned the Mechanic he debuts in Volume 12 and sort of immediately is established as a bit of a Mary Sue kind of author insertion for Vic Milan. But a character that I've always liked, even though he's a little shameless. I figured it was fair to say, since I'm now on record with these videos as saying that Vic Milan is my favorite Wildcards contributor, and that Mark Meadows is my favorite character. I've said that many times, I think, over the course of these videos. So I don't feel too guilty in going negative here, because this one's not good. This to me is the weakest, one of the weakest parts of, well, I mean, it's all right. I still enjoy Vic Milan's writing style, but it's just not very good. I don't like it. The main thrust of it, it's not very Card Sharks related. It's not really related to the Card Sharks conspiracy, but it sets up a status quo for the following book, wherein the friendship that had developed between Meadows and the Mechanic in Turn of the Cards dissolves in this book. The two characters become estranged at the end of this book, and actually will never really reunite. It's kind of, this is the end of that friendship, which is certainly interesting, and much is made in Volume 12 and in this story about the fact that they have kind of differing politics, with Mark Meadows being the last hippie, very very much liberal socialist, and the Mechanic being libertarian. But they still make it work despite that. But it couldn't last forever, and so it ends here, partly through the machinations of this kind of lame villain that I don't like very much, that I don't think works. Overall, I don't think this story works. So it is my least favorite Vic Milan contributions. Again, I think I can say that safely since I've sung his praises so many times and will continue to do so in later Vic stories. So I think it's fair for me to go negative one time. So sorry, Vic. You know, all respect, all due respect to the dearly departed Mr. Milan, but yeah, this one doesn't work for me. Next is Paths of Silence and of Night, which is sees Leanne C. Harper returning to her character Vagabond, and also to Vagabond being the character she wrote for volumes 1, 3, and 5. At the end of volume 5, Vagabond, along with another of her characters, C.C. Ryder, who I think may be considered a co-creation of Harper and her sometime writing partner, Edward Bryant. But at the end of volume 5, Harper had Vagabond and C.C. Ryder announce that they were going to go to Guatemala to assist in the wildcard revolution that was happening there. And of course, that revolution was something that was detailed by Harper in volume 4 in the story Blood Rights, with the characters of the hero twins. So it certainly made sense for Vagabond to go to Guatemala and try to help the hero twins from an exterior perspective, because you can look at it and say, oh, of course, Harper created both characters, so why not have her combine them? And from a story perspective, it was a development that always seemed a little out of left field. It didn't really ever. It was not totally clear why those two characters suddenly became interested in the Guatemalan Revolution. Although C.C. Ryder was an activist in the '60s, so I guess if she convinced Vagabond to go with her, that would kind of make sense. When we catch up with Vagabond here, there's definitely a gap in the story, although not one that's too confusing. But it does leave, it's a little bit open. There's in terms of their not everything is spelled out. C.C. Ryder is nowhere to be seen when we catch up with Vagabond in Guatemala here. Meanwhile, Vagabond herself seems not at all interested in the Guatemalan Revolution, and there's a sense that maybe she never was. So the implication is maybe that once they got to Guatemala, particularly like the jungles, that Vagabond, who has always had more of an affinity for animals, since that's her whole ace thing, is that she is in telepathic communication with animals. And the implication is that living in the city of New York was kind of the worst place for her, because even though there are rats and pigeons and house pets and some animals to be found in that place, it also is not. It's also a place really defined by teeming humanity and concrete and towering architecture and man-made constructs, and not really the place for Vagabond. So upon arriving in Guatemala, it seems like the implication is that now amongst the jungles and all the teeming wildlife of this new setting, she just kind of said, hey, this is where I want to be. I'm just going to live in the jungle, or at least as jungle adjacent as it's possible for a single human being to do. And maybe Cece, meanwhile, decided to go off and help with the revolution like she said she was going to, and Vagabond just said, I'm not interested in human wars anymore. I'll just hang with my animals. So that's kind of the implication. So what we see here is some card shark operations that are occurring in Guatemala kind of force Vagabond to sort of once again kind of enter the world of humans and human intrigues that she felt that she had kind of left behind after the events of Volume 5. And there's a nice bit of continuity where, as I mentioned just in the video for Dealer's Choice, how Vagabond had her two cats, one of which was this kind of oversized black cat. Now that she's in the Guatemalan jungle, she's kind of traded up, and one of her constant companions is a giant black wildcat, a black jaguar panther. Can't remember if it's a jaguar or panther, but either way, it's kind of a nice little touch that she's like, she already, her love of kind of very large black felines continues. And I have a love for black felines myself. So I can empathize. So that's a nice touch. From there, we go to Feeding Frenzy by Walter John Williams, which is about Black Shadow teaming up with Croyd Crenson to really do some damage to the card sharks. This story is just freaking awesome. By far the best story in marked cards. Anyone who tells you different is lying. Black Shadow is he's sort of one of the few true superheroes of the Wild Cards universe, because obviously superhuman powers and the kind of powers that we see in superhero comics are the whole foundational thing of Wild Cards, the whole foundational science fictional element that the series is sold on. But in practice, as anyone who's read the books knows, not everyone is. There are some good guys, there are some bad guys, there are some people in between, but very few people who put on a costume and have a secret identity and fight crime with their superpowers and end up having very solid, impressive victories over truly villainous foes. It's things are never quite that sort of simplified down to those kind of superhero tropes, or at least not all of them in one story. You might get like one superhero trope here and another one in another book, but Black Shadow really kind of takes all the superhero tropes, the cool powers, the cool costume, the secret identity. I guess not quite a secret headquarters, but close. Even kind of a sidekick in this story in the form of Croyd, the sleeper, kind of taking that role of sidekick. And some truly like horrible superpowered villains that have with no redeeming value or no redeeming qualities, that have to just be taken down hard. And then it happens. It actually happens, and the bad guys don't win, which is not a foregone conclusion with Wild Cards. In fact, the bad guys win quite often in Wild Cards, I think. You would expect, maybe on paper, it almost sounds like a little too comic booky or something. But in practice, it's just so satisfying because Black Shadow is just, Walter John Williams is just such a good writer, and his prose is so great, and his ability to kind of just sort of paint a character in very few kind of very economic strokes, like just with a few choice lines to really get you inside a character's head and make them seem three-dimensional. Even a character like Black Shadow, who's this costume vigilante who's just kind of kicking ass and taking names throughout the story, and it just works. Every single moment just works. It's so good. It's so good. So yeah, Feeding Frenzy is awesome. The other cool thing about Feeding Frenzy is that Walter John Williams gets to be the guy to actually go into a little bit of the backstory of the card sharks, and a little bit about the origins that we never really got. Even with all the flashbacks in the previous book, the card sharks remained a bit shadowy and a little bit mysterious. In this one, we actually get inside the head of one of the card sharks, and they actually talk about the origins. And ironically, it ends up all going back to Albert Einstein, who is a character in Wild Cards. We see Albert Einstein as a very sympathetic figure in the very earliest Wild Card series, where he's kind of the first person to believe Dr. Tachyon, and to actually get the military mobilized looking for the wild card virus before it is unleashed upon humanity, which does happen. So, but you get the sense that at least we had a fighting chance because of Albert Einstein. So he was actually like very much a heroic figure, as history, obviously, as he is in real life history, of course. But in this one, we learn that actually Albert Einstein was the one who kind of did the math regarding the sort of vectors, the potential spread of the wild card virus over the decades, and to be kind of overwhelmed by the math and what the future held based on the numbers, and realized something had to be done about the wild card virus before humanity is just sort of overrun by mutation. And so he actually founded the Card Sharks, founded an organization to try and do something about this spread before it's too late. Although then it is established that he he certainly wasn't interested in any kind of criminal ways of making this happen, or certainly not lethal methods, much less genocide, which is what the card sharks eventually come to. So it is established that other members of the card sharks eventually decided that Albert Einstein had to be dealt with. So they don't go into detail, but they essentially do come out and say that the card sharks assassinated Albert Einstein at some point. Not a story that we've ever been told in detail, but an interesting little wrinkle in the wild cards history, in the alternate history of the 20th century that wild cards presents. So yeah, that one cool detail among many. It's just, yeah, Feeding Frenzy is just one of those chef's kiss wild cards entries, one of the all-time best. And I said I would do this in one video, but I'm looking at the clock on the wall and I'm getting as long-winded as I usually do. So we'll break this up into 2 videos. So this has been part 1 of what it will now, we'll call it a two-part breakdown of Wild Cards 14 : marked cards. And hopefully you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll come back for part 2, which will be up in a week. All right, until then.
To try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing. But before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.